Quick, landlord's entry rights and restrictions. So in California, the presumption is not that the landlord can enter for any reason if they just give the tenant a notice. The presumption is the landlord cannot enter and disturb the tenant's right to quiet enjoyment unless the landlord complies with the statutory notice requirements. Now, what this means is that the landlord has to give proper notice, which is timely delivered, and it has to be for a proper basis. So first, what are the bases that a landlord can enter? And it's actually like statutory requirements. It's not whatever the landlord thinks is reasonable or what they've always done in the past. There's specific reasons that are allowed for landlord entry. So one of the reasons is for actual emergencies. Another is necessary repairs, decorations, alterations, or improvements. Another one would be necessary or agreed upon services if the two parties, the landlord and tenant, have contracted for that in the past. And then to show the unit to workers or interested renters or purchasers. Five, conduct pre-move out inspection, which the landlord is obligated to give the tenant the right but not the obligation to perform the pre-move out inspection. If the tenant opts to do that, then the landlord has to give the tenant notice within 2 weeks of the move out to do the walkthrough inspection. And that gives the tenant notice of what is going to be deducted from the security deposit if the tenant doesn't repair, clean, ameliorate those defects prior to the move out. And then after abandonment by a former tenant. Also, water sub-metering. If you have a sub-meter for the water, individually to be metered, then the landlord is allowed to enter to service it, to check the sub-metering, to ensure that the sub-metering facility, that the sub-metering device as well is properly functioning. And then also to inspect balconies. There's been a high-profile balcony collapse. I think it was in Berkeley a few years ago that prompted a new law. So landlords not just can but shall and must inspect balconies and other elevated structures periodically. Also, if the resident has personal agriculture growing, the landlord is allowed to inspect that to make sure it complies with the rules, with the covenants, with the laws. And then smoke and CO2 alarms, landlords allowed to enter to inspect those, and they should. And then water beds. If the tenant has a water bed, many got rid of them years ago, but if they still do, the landlord is allowed under certain circumstances to enter for the inspection of the water bed, make sure it's proper upkeep, make sure it's installed correctly, not leaking, because that can cause a huge amount of damage, which in some cases the landlord could be liable for. Next, did the landlord provide proper notice? So the landlord has to normally give the notice in writing, but there are exceptions. And the timeliness is normally the landlord must give writing 24 hours prior to the entry. Now, for a pre-move out inspection, which we talked about earlier, the landlord has to give 48 hours prior to moving. So the way that goes is the tenant gives notice of move out, or the landlord decides not to renew the lease. There's a move out date that's been established. The landlord gives the tenant the notice that you have the right to request a walkthrough inspection. You don't have to do it, but you have the right to. And if the tenant requests it, then the landlord must schedule that move out inspection 2 weeks or sooner to the move out date, not 2 weeks or more, has to be 2 weeks or closer to that move out date. And then once that date is mutually agreed upon, the landlord shall give another notice 48 hours prior to entry that this will be the date for your pre-move out inspection, also formerly known as the initial inspection. Now, the tenant can waive the notice requirement, but that waiver has to be in writing. There has to be some kind of proof that there was a waiver of it. And then the notice must include the date, the approximate time, and the purpose for the entry. Now, what happens if the resident refuses entry? Well, the tenant is not allowed to withhold reasonable access if a valid notice was timely served for a valid basis by the landlord. But if the tenant withholds entry, the landlord shall not enter. But don't worry, the landlord still has another option, and that is to serve the 3-day notice to perform the covenants, which is to allow the landlord entry or quit the tenancy. And then the consequences for the landlord's abuse of the right of access, that abuse can constitute a breach of the resident's right of quiet enjoyment, and it could result in punitive damages against the landlord for up to $2,000 per violation. So you can see the California Civil Codes 1940.2, 1954. Section D. And then lastly, the exceptions to the notice requirements. These are examples when the notice requirements could be waived for an actual emergency, when the resident is present and consents to the entry, after the resident has abandoned the premises, or if there's an oral agreement made between the landlord and tenant to allow the landlord or maintenance workers to enter for repairs and services performed within 1 week of that oral agreement. In other words, if the landlord and tenant make an oral agreement that there's going to be periodic, routine, frequent entries over the next few days or so, then they don't need to have a written notice 24 hours prior to each entry. These are repeated entries within a short amount of time. But it has to be performed within 1 week of that oral agreement. Otherwise, if it goes beyond that, there has to be a written agreement for normal use, or they can reset and have another oral agreement. But the landlord should make sure that they've codified that. It would be a good idea to maybe send up a follow-up email to the tenant after that oral agreement, just confirming what was agreed. It gives the landlord a little bit of proof if this ever gets litigated. Okay, so that was California landlords' rights and restrictions when it comes to entering the tenant's premises. I hope you found this helpful.